I would like to welcome up here Bob Sam. He is local here to Sitka. So his talk tonight will be on the histories and stories of Sitka's cemetery. So for the last 30 years, Mr. Sam has been working cleaning and restoring cemeteries and graves in Sitka and all throughout southeast Alaska. So beyond just caring for the physical sites themselves, he researches the often forgotten histories and stories of these sites. So over the last 30 years, he's restored more than 100,000 graves and repatriated more than 800 bodies. So he is a current member of the Sitka Tribe of Alaska Tribal Council, first served in the 90s, and he keeps getting reelected, so he's clearly doing a good job. So why don't we give him a warm welcome. Thank you, Mr.
Actually, it takes a lot of preparation to speak in public. It's not easy for a guy like me to be a public speaker. I've been a cemetery caretaker my whole life. I've been doing it since I was a very small child growing up here in Sitka. I grew up in the village of Sitka. This is, although this photo is a 1924 photo, the village I grew up in at one time was larger than the community of Sitka. There were more people living in the village than there were living in the community. A large amount of native people have very strong ties with this village. At one time, I would say about 1,600 people lived in the village prior to statehood. And we still have ties. A lot of us still have ties to this village. A lot of those homes that you see here are traditional clan homes, and many of the clans and families of Sitka have very strong ties to every single one of these houses. Look here. And before World War II, all of these homes had grave sites, clan-owned grave sites that extended from their clan houses all the way behind, all the way to Swan Lake. Prior to World War II, Sitka was primarily a cemetery site. Everything behind the village was all graves. Everything. From the blockhouse all the way to the Forest Service building, that includes Lakeside, Marine Street, all of that was once cemetery. All of it. This is a story of America. This is a story of what happens to Native American graves as America grew. It's not an easy history to talk about. It really isn't. But it's our shared history. Right around World War II, all the land of the clan houses used to go all the way to the low tide mark. We used to own all of the properties all the way to the low tide mark and all the way to Swan Lake. And then the city had what they call a quick claim deed. And during World War II, the military took over the whole waterfront, and everyone lost ownership of we only was able to claim the high tide mark. And then there was a straight line that went from the blockhouse all the way down Marine Street. And we lost title to much of the property behind Marine Street. So it was very much a difficult time for the Native community. And the city of Sitka actually rezoned the whole city through quick claim process. They identified what were going to be schools, churches, residential areas, commercial areas, industrial areas, cemeteries, and public places. It's very difficult for me to speak publicly of this history, and some of it has happened in my lifetime. In 1953, they were going to condemn the whole village. Condemn it and tear down all of the houses and rezone it industrial commercial zone. And they were going to move everybody into the Russian Orthodox cemetery and create kind of a reserve. So that was a very painful part of our history. It shows how far we've gone as a community, which is a long, long ways. There are approximately 25 major cemeteries here in Sitka, Alaska. There are about 80,000 people buried here in Sitka right now today. There are more people dead in Sitka than are alive. Sitka is a very, very old community. It's one of the oldest communities west of the Mississippi. It has some of the oldest cemeteries west of the Mississippi. The National Cemetery is one of the oldest national cemeteries in America, west of the Mississippi. So that's how old this community is. And there are many, many Christian burials, both native and non-native. Most of the graves that were located behind the village have been moved from the 30s, from the 1930s. There were elders at that time who had the vision, and they knew that many of these places were going to get disturbed. So many of those old graves have been moved to another location. Some have ended up in museums across the country, but those are slowly being brought back home and reburied. This is what the cemetery looked like in 1924. 1924 was a very, very special year for Sitka. It was the year Sitka cleaned up the town. We had a visitor in 1924, and so the whole community of Sitka cleaned up. The Totem Park cleaned up, the downtown Sitka cleaned up, the village cleaned up, And who was this visitor? President Garfield came to Sitka. And Sitka cleaned up all of their cemeteries, all of them. In 1924 was the last major cleanup of the Orthodox cemetery. This is what it looked like after the cleanup. And this is the entrance off Observatory Street. And now you know why Observatory Street was called Observatory Street. Because of the very top is what they call a platform. This platform is what the Russian Orthodox Church, every year they would have a service in the cemetery, and right here the whole congregation would get together and they would have what they would call a Rice Sunday, where the people would come up. Everybody used to come up to the cemetery, and they would have a special service called Rice Sunday, and it would be like a picnic. All the families would come up and clean up their family plots. And during this time, every single family in the village, there was always somebody in the family that would come up to the cemetery and clean their family plots. Every family had somebody who would do that. And in time, things began to change. Modern life began to come to the village. Modern life began to come to Sitka. TV, everybody, radio. We got to see what the world started to look like. And people began to forget about these places. And more people, more families began to forget that they had family plots. And the places began to fall into disarray. I remember the cemetery when it looked like this. It was completely overgrown. You couldn't tell at all that it was even a cemetery. And I had no idea at all what my future was going to be like. The reason I started doing this work was because this behind the village there was many graves that have been disturbed, desecrated. There were graves that were robbed. Homes were being built on top of graves. And when the homes were built, quite often people would take the artifacts out of the coffins and they would sell the artifacts on an open market, and they would actually make enough money from those artifacts to pay for their home. That's how valuable artifacts were coming out of these graves. And it was so sad. There were human remains littered all over the ground, all over the place. And it was very sad. And this is the cemetery as I remember it back in the 60s. High school graduation. I myself got my book deposit, $15, bought all the booze I could, went up there, and I contributed to this pile. This is how the cemetery looked when I first went in there. This is the cemetery. Every headstone in this cemetery was completely destroyed, and it was one of the saddest places anywhere. It was not a place for Sitka to be proud of. I began to rebury human remains in there, and this is what the cemetery looks like today. Completely changed. This cemetery is one of the most beautiful places you'll ever see today. There's no place like it in the world. No place. There's no place as beautiful as this place. There are approximately 1,600 bodies in the Orthodox cemetery today. It's still being used. And there are people who go up and clean up their family plots today, and it gets about 50 to 100 tourists come to Sitka just to see this place. It's a very, very famous place today. Our tourists, our average tourists, are people like you, in your age group. Mostly older people. You see them on the tour ships. And those small ships that come to Sitka that stay here for a few days, the ones with the money, that spend a lot of money in this community, you know why they come here? To see this place. And they love it in here. I've met people in this cemetery. One day I walked in here, I met an elderly lady. She was from the Ukraine. And she was well into her 90s back in 1980. And when I met her, she was looking for her ancestors that was buried in here. She came to Sitka in 1920. And in 1920, she couldn't find her ancestor in here. It was so overgrown. And she asked me, she gave me the name. And I says, oh yeah, she's buried right over here. And I took her over there and I showed her where her ancestor was buried. She cried. I allowed her her private time, and she gave me $50, thanked me for taking care of her relative, and she went home back to New York, and she passed away. So that was my beginning, when I began to realize how important my work was beginning to be. There are many, many quite famous people buried in the Orthodox cemetery. This is only one of many. His name is Paul Liberty. He's one of the founding members of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and the Alaska Native Sisterhood. He's like a saint to the Orthodox Church. He wrote songs that are still being sung in the church in Tlingit. And so he's very loved and very famous, and he's one of our 12 members, founding members of the Alaskan Native Brotherhood. And he died at a very young age. Had he lived, he would have been an incredible, incredible man. This is the cemetery up in Indian River. They call it the Indian River Cemetery. This cemetery, back in the 80s, you couldn't even walk in there. It was completely overgrown. All this wood, all these dead trees, it was completely overgrown with standing dead trees. And you couldn't even walk in there. It was so dark, you couldn't see anything. You couldn't see headstones or anything. And one day, there was a guy in here who was homeless. And for firewood, he started cutting down these trees, and he didn't care. And all the trees started falling down on these headstones. And I went up there, and I saw what a horrible, horrible place this was. So I started clearing out all those standing dead trees. It took 2 years of removing wood from this cemetery. And during this time, the cemetery was transferred over to the Alaska Native Brotherhood Camp 1. It was turned over to them because this cemetery is made up of all the people that lived in the cottages next by here, right across the street. All those homes. They lived in the cottages. And many of the people that are in here, many of them are founding members of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and the Alaska Native Sisterhood. People like Peter Simpson and others are buried in here. So it's a very, very important cemetery to the Native community. But most people today don't even know that this cemetery even exists. Most people, I would say most people don't even visit this place at all. It's still an unknown place. But still there are families that go up there and take care of their individual plots, and we still work on this place, and there are still people today who are being buried in there. And a couple of years ago, my friend Andy Roberts took it upon himself to continue cleaning this cemetery. So him and I started limbing all the branches, lower limbs, and opening it up even more. And so the cemetery really started becoming a very, very beautiful place to go through. Bears are still in there. There's lots of deer in there. It's still a very wild place. Native cemeteries really are kind of wild places. They're nature places, and they kind of blend into nature. So all of our grave sites, we love them like this. But we still go in and try to clean it up as much as we can. There's a lot of really, really famous people buried in there. one lady, they call her Princess Thumb. She's very famous here in Sitka, very famous rich Tlingit lady from Yakutat. And she was one of the only Tlingit ladies who had 2 husbands. She was that rich. And this is, you could see the work that has been done on this cemetery. I really would like to thank the Sitka Historical Society over the many years that we've been working in here. I really would like to thank them because this is actually a facelift by them. They cut all the lower limbs, picked up all the trash, and cleared this whole front of the cemetery. And it really looks very beautiful today. It's a Sitka Historical Society, elderly people, the board members that actually went up there and cleaned this place up. They worked very hard. And so I really want to publicly thank them for their assistance on this cemetery. And this sign, every cemetery has a sign that lists how you conduct yourself in the cemetery. It's sacred ground, no alcohol use, and to respect the place. The city put these signs in every single cemetery in Sitka, so we've been becoming a long ways to restoring these places. This is still how the Indian River Cemetery looks. This is the condition of many of the gravestones in there. This is how they still look today. And so I'm trying to get support so that we could restore these headstones and clean up these grave markers and clear a lot of these brushes. There's still a lot of headstones that even I haven't found yet. I've been doing this work for 30 years and I'm still finding headstones in these places. The Indian River Cemetery has a lot of unmarked graves. We don't know who they are. But we do have records. There's records on the internet, there's old Bibles, there's old records that I've been looking at that we've been finding information, and these headstones were made in Port Townsend. Every headstone, American headstone, were shipped up to Alaska by the ships, and the headstones were used as ballast for the ships coming up from Port Townsend. So that's how they got to Sitka. This cemetery has only recently been restored. This is how it looked in the beginning, with all the brush all over the place. Salmonberry brush, Japanese knotweed. All of the headstones were unreadable and needed a lot of work. This cemetery I chose to clean up with the Sesquicentennial Committee. When I first met with them and became a part of the committee, I told them, if we're going to honor Sitka in the sesquicentennial, if we're going to honor the people who were here in 1867, we better clean up their cemetery. We better put flowers on their graves. We better honor them before we even talk about them. This section right here is actually taken care of by the Sitka Women's Club. The building, Sitka Women's Building, was once owned by the people here. And so they actually take care of this section, and it was the only section of this cemetery that was taken care of. The only one. It was all completely grown over. So I want to thank the Sitka Women's Club for taking good care of that section. They kept it painted and well taken care of. But I went up and I cleared out all this brush. And I limbed all the trees. And today, it's a very, very beautiful place. And this place is very important to Sitka. Very important. It's very important to the people of Sitka. This is de Graaf. You know de Graaf. He's a business owner here in Sitka. And also he's kind of a famous photographer. There are many, many photos of Edward de Graaf and that are located here at the park. And so his gravestones and his family plots are cleaned up. You could see the condition of the graves. This is before I cleaned it up. And also, this grave right here is another famous photographer, and he has a rock over here called Merrill Rock. E.W. Merrill is buried in this cemetery. His grave is another grave that has always been taken care of. It turns out he was a very good-looking man and a very famous man as well. And his grave has a history. It's the only grave in this cemetery that has always had fresh flowers placed on his grave. Even today, I actually know somebody who came to Sitka last week. I saw her. And when I saw her, I knew there was going to be fresh flowers on Merrill's grave. I knew. So I went up there and yes, they're there. That's the kind of man Merrill is and still is today. A very important man for the history of Sitka with his photography. And he was very loved by the native community. You could see by his photography. You could see how comfortable the native people were. And so he was called the father of pictures. And so he was another famous person from this cemetery. And there are many others here as well. Les Yaw is also buried there. The Thompsons. All these people all had businesses downtown Sitka. I call this cemetery the Chamber of Commerce Cemetery. All of the downtown business owners are buried in this cemetery. And I used to think there were no native people buried here because this is a Presbyterian cemetery. There were 2 Presbyterian churches in Sitka, so there were 2 Presbyterian cemeteries. The other Presbyterian cemeteries was Indian River. This was where the non-native Presbyterian people were buried. I used to think there were no native people buried in here, but Mrs. Thompson was Tlingit. Her husband, Thompson, was a business owner in town. Mr. Thompson was a fluent Tlingit speaker. And during those days, every business in town had a special relationship with individual native families in Sitka for food, for goods, for artwork. There was like a special relationship. The native people were able to go to Thompson's store, charge things, go to Russell's and charge things, go to the grocery stores and charge things, is because of our relationship. We provided berries and food, so there was really a very strong connection between the native community and you. If this connection wasn't there prior to statehood, quite honestly, you would have starved. There was that kind of dependence, interdependence with the native community. And we had to work and live together. We had to provide our food together and live together. There was that kind of independence and connection. Boyd Diedrichson, him and I did a lot of reburials. Boyd got me involved when I was very young. I really got a lot of respect for this man. I wanted to talk a little bit about Boyd because there were a lot of disturbances of grave sites in the village. And Boyd and I took it upon ourselves to gather up all those remains, put them in boxes, and make sure they were properly reburied. It took us 2 years of reburials. And all along those 2 years, I got a lot of support from Boyd. So I'm really happy that Boyd helped me. I put this was just last year during the Presbyterian cleanup of that cemetery. I put this article up here because the community of Sitka came together. The Coast Guard, the people who had trucks, the individuals, many, many people came up to the Presbyterian Cemetery and contributed their time to make sure that cemetery is a beautiful place today. So that's how it looks today. It's very, very beautiful place. And I'm very proud of the work that we did here. There's a unknown man buried right here in this section. He's a Russian military man. He's one of the few Russians that decided to stay in Sitka after the transfer. And he was a Russian military man who died in Sitka. And at the time there was no military cemetery in Sitka at all. So they buried him right there in an unmarked grave. And it was because of him that the National Cemetery was created. And he's buried outside of the National Cemetery. But it was because of him that they started the National Cemetery up there in where it is now. And the Sitka Memorial Park has always been a very beautiful place. I'm going to start showing you a few headstones. This headstone is Francis Paul. Most of the headstones in the Orthodox cemetery looked like this in the beginning. All covered with moss. You couldn't really read them. This is actually a nice one. You can actually read what's on the gravestone. But in the early 90s, Sitka tribe and the city tried to convince me to apply for a grant to go up and restore all of these headstones and hire a professional person, someone who knows how to fix headstones, a professional person to hire. And both the tribe and the city all said they would help me. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. Nothing. Until one day I realized I'm professional. This is work that I do. So I went up there and I started cleaning these graves. And every single gravestone in the Orthodox cemetery was destroyed, knocked over, completely covered over, so I put them all back up. Every single one of them. And I started washing the headstones and cleaning them. And I never use any chemicals at all. No bleach, nothing. I use rainwater. And as I clean these gravestones, my brush gets dirty. And as my brush gets filthy dirty, the water gets dirty, and it gets a lot of dirt in the water, and the dirt becomes abrasive. and it cleans out all the moss. So it's really easy for me to clean the moss off headstones. It's amazing what happens to a cemetery after you clear all the brush and put up all the headstones. You couldn't even walk in here before. It was so dark. Now it's so bright and beautiful. It's a very beautiful place today. This is, here in Sitka, there was 2 mausoleums located on Mount Edgecumbe. There were 138 mostly Alaska natives buried in a mausoleum on Mount Edgecumbe, both in Mermaid's Cove and John Brown's Beach. And during the airport construction, the Department of Transportation and the airport and the state of Alaska paid to research all the bodies and to find all the families and send all the families back home. And I actually got a phone call from a city assemblyman. And he said, "Bob, you need to know what's going on over by the airport." And he gave me an update. And so I took a trip to Juneau and I met with the governor. And I asked him questions about the mausoleum over on Mount Edgecumbe. And I began to share information of some of the people that were buried in that mausoleum. And this was even before NAGPRA was even a law. And the governor asked me if I could find all the families and if I could work with him to relocate all the bodies and send them back home. I had no experience, actually. And to tell you the truth, I lied. I said, yes, I could. But fortunately, I had a lot of help. The whole state of Alaska came together. Everybody came together. Alaska Airlines, everybody, the tribe, the city, the state of Alaska, Department of Transportation, all the tribes in Alaska, all the families, all the villages, everybody it was actually a miracle that I found families. And we sent them home. And 40 of their families decided that they wanted to bury their loved ones at the Sitka Memorial Park, because that Sitka was all they knew. These children lived and died at the sanitarium. That was all they knew. So we buried 40 of them, and we called the project The Journey Back Home. So this project was nominated the best project in the United States for tribal relations. The best one. And I'm very happy about it. FAA provided a lot of the funding for this project. This headstone I didn't know there was another cemetery here in Sitka. I didn't know this cemetery even existed. It's a Chinese cemetery. Sitka once had the most beautiful Chinese cemetery in Alaska. Cannery workers, Chinese cannery workers who worked in Sitka over 100 years ago. Many died in Sitka. And today they are still buried, but the top has been destroyed. I wanted to share this because even though a long time has passed, there are still oral histories of this place. People never, ever forget where grave sites are. They tried to cover up this place and thought we would forget. But there are records, and I will do my best to preserve the Chinese cemetery of Sitka, even though that's the only grave marker left. I'm going to make sure that place is protected, and I'm going to make an issue of it. These are just Peter Simpson and more pictures of Indian River Cemetery. And its work is still going on. We're still cleaning it up as much as we can. And this is Princess Tom I was talking about, a very rich lady. And both her husbands are buried next to her. So she's quite the lady. This here is a very famous artist. His name is Sitka Jack. Sitka Jack is a very famous artist in Sitka. He does silver work. Other famous people that are buried in there are silversmith Jim Jacobs, others. Many master artists are buried in these places. And this headstone is very large. And it's fortunate that we have people here in Sitka that 20 years ago, if people would knock over these headstones, and they have, sometimes 30, 40 headstones would get knocked over. 20 years ago, it would have been only myself and a couple other people to put them back up, and that was it. Today, it is no longer like that. Today, if these headstones were all knocked over, it doesn't matter how many there are. It could be 30, 40. If they were knocked over, I can guarantee you the police, the Trooper Academy, the community, we would go right up there that very same day and we would put them all back up. The last 2 years, it's been that way. Plus, something I did, I put, there used to be stone all around a lot of these graves. I actually shoveled dirt all around these stones, covered up all of these cement bases, so that when vandalism does happen, if this headstone does fall over, it's only going to hit soil. So very little damage happens to the gravestones today, and it's really quite easy to put these headstones back up. I've actually discovered the secret of the pyramids. I have. It's not muscle. It's not brawn. It's brains and leverage to put these huge headstones back up. So I go downtown, I find the biggest Indians I could find, I take them up here, and I talk them into putting the headstones back up. And all I have to do is stand by and be the brains. So I have a lot of people that I'm very grateful for. Some of them are in this room tonight. This is how big the Russian Orthodox cemetery is. It's about 7 acres. This is Swan Lake. This is the cemetery. Right here is the Lutheran cemetery. The Lutheran cemetery, Princess Maksudov, she's the most looked for cemetery in Sitka. And there's lots of signs showing where she's buried, posted all over Sitka. But all of the tourists who come to Sitka, because of the tour guides, they always list Princess Maksudov. And so they come up to the cemetery, and they're all looking in here, and they're looking for Princess Maksudov, and they can't find her. And so I point them down to this area to where she's buried. This small section is known as the Lutheran Cemetery today. This whole section once belonged, kind of like grandfathered in, it all used to belong to the Orthodox Church. But back in the 80s, it was turned over to the Lutheran Church. So this section belongs to the Lutheran Church now. This section is also a part of the Orthodox cemetery today. But this section right here used to be an old road. They used to call it the Ice Road. Back in the time of Russian America, Sitka used to get ice from Swan Lake and take the ice by horse and wagon and go up this hill to where this church is. And by the time they got here, it was downhill all the way to the docks. And that road is still there today. And it's still very much traveled. Lots of people love walking on this road. I would like to restore that road and make it either a bike trail or a pedestrian walkway, because lots of people of Sitka use this trail today. And so there's about 7.2 acres there, and it's one of the last places, if you look at an aerial view of Sitka, this area is the last forested area in the downtown Sitka. We're very fortunate to have a forest in downtown Sitka where it produces oxygen and clouds. You could see the clouds even today. This forest produces clouds. It does. It's so huge it produces clouds. And also the trees in there are on the verge of becoming old growth trees, right on the verge. I don't know if I can work this. Maybe the battery died.
I think that might be the last picture in your slide.
Good. Good. Yeah.
Double check.
Yeah, it was. That's good. There are many, many other cemeteries here in Sitka. The one cemetery that I'm very fond of, that very few people know is a cemetery, is Halibut Point Rec. Halibut Point Recreation Area on the southern part where the totem pole is located now today, and Magic Island is located, in that road that goes to Magic Island, that whole road is completely covered with graves. A lot of people don't realize that parks were once cemeteries. They became cemeteries and parks because you couldn't really build on them. It would be too hard to move the bodies. And Halibut Point Rec has many bodies. Old, ancient, traditional burial places, Christian burials. There's actually even a family that once owned Indian River prior to World War II, and that's the family of Al Gray. They lived out there at Halibut Point Rec prior to World War II. And one of the family was actually born out there. His name was Howard Gray. Howard Gray and Al Gray their parents are buried, actually, still buried in Orthodox graves, still buried out there in Halibut Point Rec. I have a question. There are 6 Orthodox graves there. Why did the parks cover them up? Why? A family plot. A family that was told to move off this land so that the military can take it over. This land is a known burial ground of that family. And I went out there. When I was a small child, my family is actually closely related to the Grays. We're very similar, very close family. And we used to go out there and clean those graves. And now they're completely covered over. I am going to get permission to clean those off and restore them, because I think it's the right thing to do. They're Christian people. I could go on and on and on about graves in Sitka, and an hour isn't enough for me to talk about this. There are many, many more. But this year, 2017, 30 years ago, all these graves were forgotten, neglected, overgrown, destroyed, lots of trash and beer bottles. Today, most beautiful place. Sitka's got the most beautiful cemeteries in America. They're all cleaned up. They're all restored. And I'm going to close by saying, Native America. In America, there's a history in America of developing on native graves. There's a long history of that in America. In Sitka, I am so happy that when a native grave gets disturbed, I could call on any one of you. Think about that. There's respect in Sitka. There's a reason why Sitka is a special place. Our ancestors are respected. That is why I cleaned up the Presbyterian Chamber of Commerce cemetery, because how happy I was that you came out to clean our graves as well. That is healing the community. That is what the sesquicentennial is all about. What a special place Sitka is, special people that live here, and how much we've come to be a community together. Respect for native graves. My feeling all along is I am Tlingit. Tlingit means human being, so I am human being just like you. So all of my ancestors are human beings just like you. And we are treating ancestors with dignity and respect in Sitka. What a blessing that is. We are changing the way America views Native American graves. We are coming together as a community, and you came to this presentation tonight. Thank you. I guess there's time for Q&A. Is there time?
Yes, we do have time for a few questions if anyone is interested. Otherwise, for those of you who do have to scoot out, thank you so much for coming out to tonight's presentation, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Where's the one Chinese grave that you found? Where exactly?
I'll keep that a secret right now. Yeah.
Bob, what is the oldest grave that you know of in Sitka?
There's a lot of really old graves in Sitka, pre-contact, but the oldest one that I've found is about 1836. It's a very beautiful grave that's in the Orthodox cemetery, but there are some that are older.
Bob, will you talk about any of this at the Clan Conference?
Yes, I will do a cemetery tour and a talk on the cemeteries at the Clan Conference. The Clan Conference will be here in Sitka. It's open to the public, and in the Clan Conference, the theme is healing, on how we can come together as a community. And so it's pretty exciting to this year's Clan Conference.
When will that be?
October 13th through the 17th. Yes.
Bob, do you know of any cemeteries in Stargavin, Old Sitka area?
Yes, there's a very old cemetery in the Stargavin area, right next to the boat launch. The old fort site there. The Orthodox Church also had, or the Russians had what they call hunters, mostly Aleut and some Tlingit, and they died out there, and they were buried. There was this very small cemetery there, that Orthodox cross, where it is now, is where some graves were thought were. Yes. The Stargavin is a very old place.
Are there any grave sites or any suspected grave areas that are pre-Russian or pre-Orthodox or pre-European contact?
There are many graves, even gravestones that are pre-contact. There's a marble bear, the community house. There used to be many of those marble bears, and the stone was brought from Prince of Wales Island, and a lot of the old pre-contact stones. Some are still in the village. There are still gravestones in the village that are pre-contact today. I keep them hidden.
Was burial pre-contact the traditional way to deal with the deceased? Were there other ways, or?
There were other ways of dealing with the deceased. The cremation was one way. Most everyday people were cremated. Cremation was the choice because Tlingit people at the time had a different concept of hell. We didn't think that hell was a place where you burned, it was a place where you froze. And so many of the people were cremated, and everyday people. And then you had mummies. A lot of the mummies ended up, some are still out there, and some are located in museums and collections in different parts of the country. But even those are coming home as well. And even babies were mummified, because when a baby died, it was believed that their spirit was so pure that it was next to God. So they were kind of seen as priests. So they were mummified as well. And I believe that's it. A lot of the cremations there are still mortuary poles. There's a pole in Sheldon Jackson Museum that was once contained mortuary remains, and there are actually cemeteries where warriors were buried. Bones and skulls were warrior cemeteries, and they were called kind of like Northern Lights places, was places where warriors were buried.
Were the bodies of shamans treated differently from those of the regular people?
They were mummified, and there are many mummies here in Sitka, many, and most of them are in very well hidden places, and quite honestly, we walk by them every day. They're there, and I keep very quiet about them, and we've learned, they're like bears, we've learned to live with them. And so it's a very sensitive subject, but we know where some are. And I myself have reburied some.
What about Tlingit beliefs about reincarnation?
That's a really good one. Many Tlinkits still, and even myself, we still believe. We still, our names are still passed down. Oftentimes when somebody dies, oftentimes another baby gets born. And we look at that baby and we say, oh, that looks just like so-and-so came back. They even have some of the same mannerisms. And some of, they look. And so we give them their name, Tlingit name, that's how Tlingit names are passed down through families. So reincarnation is still very much alive and well here. Sitka is all southeast Alaska, Tlingit is a wonderful, wonderful culture of people. We're very fortunate that we still have our culture today, especially our mortuary practices are still with us. We still do our best to help the families during their times of grief. And actually, I've noticed one thing about Sitka. Some of you have been living with us so long that you actually acclimated. Some of you have taken our mortuary practices and made it yours. Like the wakes, staying up all night, 40 days, helping the families. You've been acclimated. That's a wonderful thing.
Do you know where Catlean is buried?
There are many Catleans. He was actually the one you're thinking of was cremated. The one that donated the property to A and B, he's actually buried straight up the hillside. And he's still there, but in an unmarked grave. Stephen Catlean.
proper pronunciation?
Kotlian.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's still buried straight up the hill. We're behind Kotlian's old house.
Thank you.
If I'm walking through one of these sites, thank you for your talk, by the way. And I notice a branch has fallen on a grave. Is it appropriate for me to remove the branch, and is there a respectful way that I should do that?
Yes, you pick it up and move it.
Great answer.
That's a good thing about Sitka in most of the cemeteries now, today, because they've been cleaned up. Sitka, and I've seen this, no matter how drunk you get, no matter how bad it gets up there in the cemetery, they will pick up after themselves and pick up the trash and the garbage. And in Sitka, when you walk through the cemeteries now, everybody picks up the garbage and throws it away. Because as soon as it starts to get neglected, that's when people start to throw more stuff on the ground. But the more you clean it up, the more you take care of it. So a sign of a healthy community is a clean cemetery. So we're a healthy community today.
Ms. Todd, you've done a lot of research over the last 30 years. Are you putting this research down in any place, or so it isn't lost?
I have it all on my laptop. I have all my photos, historical photos, notes, old Bibles, old research, old maps. I've actually become very good at this work. I've become very professional. I've traveled all over the world, actually, helping other tribes. I recently helped Hokkaido. I spent the last 10 years convincing the Japanese government to return 1,800 bodies of Ainu people back to Hokkaido. And we're going to rebury all those bodies in the next 4 years. We've already got 200 bodies reburied, and we're reviving Ainu culture, and we're improving the relationship between the Japanese government and the indigenous Ainu people. And next year, I'll be going to Taiwan, to New Zealand, and Hawaii to help the people get their ancestors back because of what I did here in Sitka and what I did in Hokkaido. So this has become kind of a movement for indigenous people to get their ancestors back. So this is exciting time we're living in. And I don't usually share these things because I like being a small town Sitka person, but I'm quite famous. I just
You're the best there is in what you do.
I'm the best there is in what I do. So
When you work with some of those graves and rebury certain remains, do you sometimes feel a certain spirit of the person really alive still and talking to you?
all spirits go to heaven. All spirits. And I've had experiences. They're nothing like you read in books. Nothing. My experiences usually occur on June 21st on a solstice. And I've seen things in a cemetery that moving fog coming out of the ground and moving. And I've reburied so many bones of desecrated graves that I've had experiences. And after 2.5 years of reburying desecrated bones, I found an old dog in the cemetery, all bones. After burying all these remains, so I decided I was going to rebury this dog. And I put him in the ground, and I was so tired, and this is why I'm thinking maybe I was just tired. But I was so tired of dealing with human remains after so many years. It really hurt my soul of actually handling remains, that I said out loud, "There's nothing but dog bones here." But the wind stopped in the cemetery, and all the wind came towards me, and I heard, "We're not dog bones." And the other area is dreams. In the beginning, there were horrible dreams. But now, it's thank you. I've received almost every award possible. In the year 2000, I received the Millennium Award from the Orthodox Church. This award is only presented once every 1,000 years. And it's awarded to somebody who has contributed to the history of the church during that 1,000 years. So over 500 Orthodox priests came to Sitka, and the Metropolitan came to Sitka to present that award and have a special ceremony at the church. And they called me up and said, "Mr. Sam, can you come down?" I says, "No, I'm kind of busy. I'm doing this, I need to do that." And finally, the priest said, "Mr. Sam, come on down." So I went down to the Centennial building, and they gave me the award.